Ah. Mm.
All right. I push recording. So welcome everyone. We are very excited to introduce the first webinar of our series of webinars in perinatal care. We are No Bump No Care, a nonprofit that tries to bring awareness in the field of perinatal care. We are organizing this series of webinars from May to September and maybe beyond, with an incredible number of scholars and guests that will illuminate different topics in the field of perinatal care. We have a stellar network of professionals. Dr. Robb is one of them. We try to help women and their network in perinatal care. Nicole here and I are the co-founders, and we try to use philosophical counseling and other specialties to bring as much awareness as possible in this unfortunately too neglected field. Today is my enormous pleasure to introduce Martin Robb. He's professor of care ethics and culture at the Open University in the UK, where he chairs the care ethics interest group and is also a member of the perinatal well-being research group. Martin's academic research has focused on questions of identity, relationships, and care, with a particular focus on men's practices and experiences of cares. He's the author of Men, Masculinities, and the Care of Children, Images and Ideas and Identities, published by Routledge in 2020. And is the co-editor with Carrie Jones of Men and Loss, New Perspectives on Bereavement, Grief and Masculinity, published by Routledge earlier this year. He also is also the curator of Careful Thinking, a great podcast focused on care. And today he's going to introduce us to the difficult topic of supporting fathers in time of loss and grief. So the floor is all yours. Thank you for presenting this webinar with us today.
Thank you, Susie. I will just share my screen. Can you see my PowerPoint? Yeah. Let's go to the beginning. So thank you, Susie, and thanks to everyone who's listening today, whether live or to the recording. I should say it's a real honor and a privilege to be the first speaker in this new series of webinars and to be able to contribute in some way to the really important work of No Bump, No Care. So thank you to Susie and Nicole for inviting me to speak and for being a part of this exciting new initiative. And I should say, given this is the first in the series, we weren't too sure who will be attending or who will be watching the recording and what everyone's specific interest might be. But I'm assuming that some people listening today have a professional interest in supporting parents who've experienced perinatal loss, while others may have an academic interest as researchers or educators. And some of us may have a deeply personal interest in the subject because of our own personal experience as a parent, or because, as most of us do, we know someone who's been through the traumatic experience of losing a child early in its life. So in what follows, I hope there'll be something that may be of interest and hopefully helpful to everyone. So the title of my talk today is Supporting Fathers Following Perinatal Loss. But before I give an outline of what I'm planning to cover in the presentation, I should perhaps just add a little bit to Susie's nice introduction of me and say a little bit about my background and my work. So as Susie said, I'm a recently promoted professor, having been a senior lecturer for a long time at the Open University in the UK, with the first and largest distance education institution in the world. And the main teaching focus of my work there is developing online courses and programs mainly for people working in the caring professions. Before joining the Open University and becoming an academic, I spent a number of years organising education initiatives with socially disadvantaged groups and vulnerable communities. But as Susie said in her introduction, my academic research over the past 25 years or so has focused on issues around identity, relationships, and care, and more specifically, the connection between men, masculinities, and the practice and experience of care. I've led research studies in the UK on men working in childcare, on engaged fatherhood, and young masculinities, care and well-being. However, the research I want to focus on today is a study that I undertook recently with my Open University colleagues Kerry Jones and Samantha Murphy on fathers' experiences of perinatal bereavement. And as Susie also said, alongside my academic work, I'm the host of the Careful Thinking podcast, in which I explore ideas about care in conversations with writers, researchers, and practitioners at the cutting edge of current thinking about care. One or two of whom I will reference today, and including Susie, and one or two of whose research I'll try to refer to. So just to give you a quick outline of the presentation, I'm going to start by just reminding us some of the facts about perinatal loss, then talk about men's experience of perinatal loss and what the research tells us. I'm then going to say something about the research study, which focused on fathers, football, and perinatal loss, and try to summarize some of the key findings from the study, illustrated with some quotations from some of the men that we interviewed. I'll then say a little bit about similar initiatives around men loss and mental and emotional well-being that we've come across. I want to then summarize the findings, but also talk about what I think the meaning of those findings are, what they can tell us about men, bereavement, and care and support. And finally, I'll say a little bit about what I think the implications are for supporting bereaved fathers. I'll say a little bit about where we've taken the research next and where we're hoping to go. And then I think there'll be time for questions. So I'm planning to talk for about 30 minutes or so. I hope that's okay. So just a reminder then of some of the facts about perinatal loss, which I think are quite well known. It's still a reality for many parents, affecting some groups of parents in some parts of the world more than others. The statistics on this slide are drawn mainly from the UK, but they're probably not dissimilar to those in, say, North America, other parts of Europe, and indeed elsewhere in the world. And I should say that rather beautiful image in the top left-hand corner of the slide is of the 2018 sculpture, The Child Who Was Never Born, by the sculptor Martin Houdecek in the Oudijk in Duinen Cemetery in The Hague in the Netherlands. I think that's rather beautiful. So moving on then to men and perinatal loss. So in recent years, there's been a real increase in academic research and writing on the impact on parents of perinatal bereavement. However, until quite recently, most of that research and writing has focused, perhaps understandably, on the impact of mothers. There's been much less work on the impact of perinatal loss on fathers. And at the same time, I think despite significant changes in gender roles and relationships, certain stereotypes about men, bereavement, and grief persist. For example, it's often assumed that fathers' grief following the loss of a child will be somehow less intense than that of mothers, perhaps reinforced by the fact that men's grieving is often less visible or expressed in less obvious ways. And social expectations around masculinity, certainly in contemporary Western societies, still tend to dictate that men should be stoic and resilient in the face of loss, and that expressing feelings of grief openly is somehow unmanly. And many fathers still see their primary role following perinatal bereavement as supporting their partner rather than getting help for themselves. So men who don't grieve in socially expected ways can feel judged and disenfranchised, and this may hinder them from expressing their feelings openly and from seeking help. Finally, I think it's true to say that men tend not to have the same informal networks that are available to women, and so can feel more isolated following a loss, while formal bereavement support often fails to engage with men or to meet their particular needs. If I could quote the words of two of the participants in our study, one man said, "At the time after our child was born, there was nothing, there was nowhere to go. In terms of a direct person to actually speak to, there wasn't that at all." While another man said, "I was pointed towards different web forums. And in comparison to women talking, the mothers talking, if you looked at the fathers section, it always had the odd one comment of someone crying for help, but with no one really coming back to help them. And I should say, sorry, another sculpture I really like, that's by the German sculptor Käthe Kollwitz in the German War Cemetery in Władzow, which she sculpted after losing her own son in the First World War. And I think it shows something of the difference in the kind of stereotypical reactions of, or ways in which men and women are said to express grief. So moving on now to our study, we believed there was a real gap in the research and an urgent need to understand the often overlooked experiences and support needs of bereaved fathers. But at the same time, we became aware of the existence of football teams, that's soccer teams for any North American listeners, organised by and for bereaved fathers. And we'd heard anecdotally about the success they seem to have had, both in attracting men in large numbers and in meeting their needs for support and in helping them to process their grief. And it's important to emphasize that these teams are set up and led by bereaved fathers themselves and not by any statutory, voluntary or professional body and without any professional input. Having said that, the teams operate very broadly under the auspices of SANS, the UK's Stillbirth and Neonatal Death Society, and hence all of the teams style themselves as SANS United, with the name of their town or locality added. The initiative's fairly recent. The first SANS United football team was set up by a bereaved father in 2017 in Northampton, England, but since then the model's been copied by other groups of bereaved fathers at locations throughout the UK, so that there's now a large and growing network of these teams. It's also important, I think, to emphasize that the primary aim of the teams is not therapeutic. The specific activities in which teams engage differ from place to place, but generally the main activities are weekly training sessions, playing matches in local leagues, and also a variety of social activities ranging from going to the pub or the bar after a training session to organising barbecues and other social events to which partners may also be invited. Having said that, all of the participants in our study mentioned that their teams also have online chat groups, mostly using WhatsApp, some of which are for general conversation, for example, about forthcoming matches, but others are set aside for more personal or intimate discussion about team members' experiences of loss. So, as academics, as researchers, we were interested to explore what it was about participation in the football teams that seemed to work for bereaved fathers. So we embarked on a small-scale research study in which we conducted in-depth online interviews with 11 men from different teams across the UK. The men were of different ages and a variety of ethnic backgrounds, but all had experienced the loss of a child in the perinatal period. We then analysed the data, and we're currently in the process of writing up our findings for journal publication. However, we've already published a review of the literature on fathers and perinatal loss in the journal Midwifery. And as Susie mentioned at the beginning, Kerry and I have co-edited a collection under the title Men and Loss, New Perspectives on Bereavement, Grief and Masculinity, published earlier this year, which includes a chapter on our research project, but also a chapter by me on the theoretical background to understanding men, masculinities, and the experiences of bereavement. So what did we conclude from our analysis of the interviews? Well, briefly, these were some of our key findings. Firstly, the football teams provided a community of shared experience of loss. The teams were often the first and the only opportunity for many of these men to grieve openly and to feel supported by other men who'd been through similar experiences. And it seemed crucial that other members of the team had shared those experiences. As one participant said, it's the team nobody wants to join, but when you join it, you'll never leave because of the support. While another man said, the main benefit for me is having people that understand without having to explain it. I've got two best friends that I've had for 20 plus years, and even now I still can't articulate it to them so that they can have a conversation with me in the same way as anybody else within the SANS United football team. A second important finding was that this collective embodied activity in the soccer teams somehow seemed to facilitate emotional openness. Participating with other men in purposeful physical activity was both more appealing than conventional talk-based support. but also succeeded in encouraging men to express their feelings of grief openly in ways that conventional methods had failed to achieve. So one man said, we used to do quite a bit of fitness drills, and if you were waiting around, then you might have a brief conversation. If you were on the side waiting, maybe you'd speak again, but it used to be mainly afterwards, after the training had finished, and we'd go to the bar and we'll sit and talk. Another man said, we always say football's secondary, really, because it's not about that. It's just about that safe place for men to come and talk. And football is just the avenue to bring us together, almost just to ensure that, this is a safe place and you're not going to be judged. And thirdly, the teams seem to provide a range of diverse spaces and opportunities for expressing feelings and for men to support each other, from those touchline conversations to the dedicated online chat groups. There was no pressure in any of these spaces to discuss their experiences of grief, but the teams provided space, times, and importantly, supportive relationships, which made it possible. So one man said, we have a very active WhatsApp group. One of the groups is purely just for support, so guys can say as much as they want, as little as they want. Some of them talk properly for the first time, but there's no fear of any judgment. If they're struggling at any stage, they can put a message on. It's just key to know you're actually being listened to and then not being ignored. Another dad said, there was a dad that was playing. We didn't know his story about his loss. And then one day he just posted in the WhatsApp group that this is my story and I thank you all for the support you've given me. So it's not that people just come along and start talking about what they want to straight away. It's when they feel comfortable. So a couple more key findings from the study. I think this is a really important one, the importance of memorialization and the way that the teams provided that. So creating opportunities to remember and honor a lost child by wearing their name on one's kit or playing matches in their memory, which all of the teams did, seemed to be a key component in the process of healing and repair for these men. And when we asked men about their motivation in either setting up or joining a team, often the first thing they said was, it was a way I could remember and honor my son or daughter to ensure they weren't forgotten. As one man said, hearing your child's name is so important to us, that recognition that they were here essentially. While another man said, anyone that joins the team and wants to carry on has a football shirt with the name of their loss on there. Last year, the opening season match was dedicated to my child, and it was really nice. We're playing for this baby today. And finally, a quite interesting and perhaps surprising finding was the importance of altruism for these men's participation in these teams. The desire to help others with similar experiences of loss seemed to be a key motive for men to join and belong to the teams, and helping others seemed to be an important way of caring for oneself. So one father said, I've kind of offered support. And obviously it's like emotional support, but also kind of just talking through those things. And I mean, you never really know what to do when something like this happens. It can be practical advice, but also kind of that emotional support. One man who was a long-standing member of a team said, I feel I'm in a very different place to where I was obviously 5 years ago, but I still feel more like giving back to other people. There's dads there who've lost children this year, and I know how horrific it is in the first few months. This time really does kind of help, and you kind of have a different perspective. So the findings from our study of the Sand United football team to some extent confirm and echo the feedback we've had from other recent initiatives that have developed innovative and imaginative ways of responding to men's experiences of grief and also other mental health issues faced specifically by men. There are a number of other initiatives that we know about that also use the medium of soccer. So, for example, in 2021, I was the academic advisor on a television programme jointly produced by the BBC and the Open University, which followed the singer James Arthur in his quest to identify the roots of his own struggles with mental health, and which featured the football team Redcar FC in the northeast of England, which is part of the football-based initiative No Substitute for Good Mental Health, and whose members are all men with experiences of mental health issues, including the loss of close family and friends. Elsewhere in the UK, and I'm sure elsewhere, other initiatives such as men's running clubs, veterans hiking groups, and even the men's sheds movement have also used collective, embodied, and often creative activity as a way to support men with mental health needs. And in the town where I live in the east of England, a local man, himself someone who's experienced mental health issues, recently set up for men to talk. an initiative which uses a range of physical activities, including a regular walking group, to encourage men to talk about mental health issues, including grief. More explicitly arts-based methods have been used by organisations such as All Right Mate in the southwest of England, which uses theatrical improvisation and photographic installations to engage men in conversations about mental health. In the online world, podcasts such as Guys and Grief, set up by bereaved fathers to help other bereaved dads, incorporate some of the elements we found in the Sounds United teams, such as building on shared experience of bereavement, on an altruistic desire to help others going through similar experiences, and for the podcast hosts themselves finding healing and repair through doing something to help others. So I think what all these diverse initiatives have in common is that they've achieved some success in engaging men through shared, often embodied, creative or playful activity. So what I'd like to do now is both summarize those key findings from our study and also talk about what I think their deeper meaning and significance is. So we found, as I said, engagement in collective embodied activity seems to have the potential to facilitate emotional openness and expressivity and contribute to emotional healing and repair, particularly for men, in ways that conventional talk-based forms of support and therapy often fail to achieve. Now, perhaps the success of these activity-based initiatives has something to do with just getting past men's traditional inhibitions inculcated by society's expectations around masculinity. But I think there's more to it than that. And if I can quote what Susie writes in her book, Human Emotions at the Origins of Bioethics, about intercorporeality and interaffectivity, drawing on the I can never say phenomenology quickly, drawing on the phenomenological insights of Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty may be relevant here, I think. So Susie writes, quote, about incorporeality-based approaches that have been used to help people to overcome distressing states and ground their being upon a more solid base. And paraphrasing Emmanuel Levinas, Susie writes that forms of co-engagement generated by tactile experiences of intercorporeality have the power to form meaningful, lasting bonds that can co-orient our lives in a meaningful way. And I think it's also important that these embodied activities of the football teams were collective and shared, intercorporeal, in fact, rather than solitary. Excuse me. That there was something of what the theatre practitioner and author of Care Aesthetics, James Thompson, described when he was a guest on my podcast as a flow of practice between people that creates the experience, both just by their mere presence together, but also about the way they touch and work off each other. And similarly, the French philosopher and dance practitioner Christine Leroy, in talking with me also on the podcast, insisted on what she describes as the kinesthetic anchoring of care, the fact that care presupposes an intentionality that's kinesthetic, that's embodied. Christine's work also draws heavily on Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of the body, but she's also indebted to the contemporary American philosopher and care ethicist Maurice Hamilton's groundbreaking work on embodied care. And I should add that Maurice has also been a guest on the podcast. Also, when we presented this research recently at a university seminar, a colleague from a psychoanalytic background made the interesting observation that perhaps there was some connection between the fact that the activities of the football teams were literally outside in the open air and the process of the men externalizing their feelings, moving them from inside to outside. If the mind, the imagination, and the body are connected in the way that Merleau-Ponty suggests, then perhaps there's something to this. And similarly, at an unconscious level, the imaginative connection between physically moving forward, as in the activities of the men's walking groups that I mentioned earlier, and psychologically and emotionally making progress may be worth considering. Second key finding then, or key thing to talk about is that forming relationships over time, relationships of trust over time, building on shared experience, seems to be crucial to engaging grieving men. As I said, sharing their experiences of loss and their feelings of grief did not come easily or quickly for the men in our study. The willingness to express their emotions openly to other men developed slowly. And in addition to the role of the shared physical activity that I've just mentioned, establishing those relationships of trust over time appeared to be crucial. It was also important that the men had an experience of loss in common, that they knew that those who they were sharing their experiences and feelings with would instinctively and intuitively get what they were talking about. And then memorializing a lost child in creative and performative ways also seemed to be a key component of men's emotional repair and recovery, establishing and maintaining a continual relationship with a lost loved one and enacting and confirming their relational identities as fathers. And as I said, the most obvious expression of this in the football teams we studied is the practice of displaying the name of the player's dead child on their football kit, wearing it as a badge either on their sleeve or their chest. The men in our study described this both as a way of remembering their children, ensuring their names were not forgotten, and honouring their memory. The name on the football kit is literally representational, representing, making present in an almost sacramental way someone who's no longer around. Similarly, the practice of playing matches in the honour of an individual dead child can also be seen as a ritual performative act, which was a key component of the men's coming to terms with their grief. In doing this, the fathers were creating and maintaining a continuing relationship with their dead child, the kind of continuing bonds that bereavement counsellors suggest are vital for processing grief. But at the same time, I would argue they were performing and reinforcing their own identity as fathers, which the men in our study repeatedly said was important to them, but that society often failed to acknowledge. Men in the study, for example, talked about going back to work and nobody ever mentioning their loss, no, not acknowledging that they'd been fathers even for a short period. And the American screenwriter Colin Campbell, whose two children were killed tragically in a car crash, writes in his 2023 grief memoir that when Ruby and Hart were killed, I no longer understood who I was. I thought of myself first and foremost as a dad to two wonderful kids. It informed every aspect of my identity. My old identity is gone, so who am I? And the Australian rock musician Nick Cave, reflecting on the death of his son Arthur in an interview also published in 2023, has said that the loss of my son defines me. So in a sense, these men's experiences of bereavement reinforce a more general point about the importance of the identity of father to many contemporary men, something reflected in my own research with young men around masculinity and identity. And then, as I said before, altruism, the desire to help others suffering in similar ways, seems to be a powerful motive for men to engage in these forms of mutual support and care for others, and can be a vital component of their own healing. And I think it's, maybe too instrumental to say that this was a way of getting healing for themselves. Helping and supporting other men was not only important in motivating them to take part in the activities in the first place. One might say that caring for others was vital to caring for oneself, that one was a means to the other. Again, there's a kind of complex or dynamic flow between care for oneself and care for the other. And I think that leads to a further and final point. I think there's a complex and intriguing connection between care for others and care for the self. And in mutual supportive activities of this kind, care is distributed and the roles of caregiver and care receiver are mobile, shifting, and dynamic. In thinking about care, we're often focused on the distinctive roles of caregiver and care receiver. But in the case of the football teams for bereaved fathers that we studied, and some of the other mutual support activities by and for men that I've mentioned, it may be more accurate to describe care not as one person acting on another, but as something that's more distributed, that flows back and forth between all those involved in dynamic and complex ways. So I think there are some implications from this work for supporting bereaved fathers. Not all service providers will be able to implement these recommendations, but perhaps they provide some pointers for future development. And of course, it's not to diminish the important support that many professionals are already providing to grieving parents, or indeed to say that all men are the same or will need or respond to identical forms of support. But engaging men through creative, shared embodied activity, at least initially, may be worth considering. If men aren't turning up to support groups or to therapy or staying the course, it may be worth thinking about engaging them through some form of activity, at least to begin with, something that enables them to respond creatively and in a physical, bodily way to their experience alongside other men, and which may act as a catalyst over time for expressing their feelings. Secondly, given that opportunities for men to share their deepest feelings in public are still rare in most modern societies, and there are still some resistances and taboos based on the persistence of those stereotypes about masculinity, we should expect the process to be slow and to depend on relationships of trust built over time, and for that to be easier when other men who have similar experiences are involved. If possible, I think it's important to incorporate opportunities for men to actively remember their dead child and to affirm their own continuing identities as fathers. Given that the wider social world often insists on denying that children who die at an early age ever existed, or that those who produced them were ever actually parents, it can be important to provide spaces and opportunities for fathers in particular to talk about their dead child, to say his or her name out loud, and to talk about their brief lives if they want to. And perhaps we shouldn't be shy about doing this ourselves as professionals or researchers. Certainly in the interviews when we were talking to men, they insisted on saying the name of their children and then asking us to do the same. And we should also find ways of acknowledging the importance of men to men of their identities as fathers, however brief that experience. And if we can appeal to men's sense of altruism and impulse to help others, I think that will also be a way of engaging men. Involving men in doing things that help other grieving fathers, as our study shows, can be a powerful way of involving them. That could be simply fundraising activities. A lot of men we spoke to talked about running marathons or other sponsored activities for other bereaved men, or it could be working together on a creative project. And as our study and other studies show, there seems to be an intimate connection between caring for others and being cared for yourself, between enabling others to heal and finding healing yourself. So just before I finish, just to say that since completing the study, we've taken it forward in a couple of ways. Besides publishing the findings in a book and in academic journals, as I've mentioned, we've been keen to share what we've learned about the needs of bereaved fathers with practitioners. We've begun to do this using the medium of drama, organising a theatre workshop with professional actors, drawing on the experiences that our participants shared with us in the study as a way of communicating our key findings to practitioners. And the photos are of a workshop we organised with a theatre group in Birmingham, England recently. We're also really grateful to two of the dads who participated in our study, Stephen and Nick, both of whom are men who've experienced the loss of a child, and both of whom are organisers and founders of Sounds United football teams, for agreeing to be interviewed by us for two podcasts, exploring firstly their experiences of loss, and then in the second podcast, the ways in which they benefited from being part of the football teams for bereaved dads. And you can find both of those podcasts on YouTube. So finally then, if I can find the right slide, that's it, yeah. If you'd like to get in touch or stay in touch, I put my email address on this last slide, also links to my Careful Thinking podcast and to my Substack newsletter. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. And the final slide is some of the references of the sources that I quoted. So I'll just stop sharing. Right.
Thank you so much.
I think I have stopped sharing. Yeah.
Yeah, you did. That was a wonderful presentation. We have people following us on YouTube.
Brilliant. Thank you, Susie.
It's working, fortunately. I break the ice with a question, if I may, and then let's see if other questions arrive. As a person who unfortunately knew a bit about the topic, I mean, in person, I noticed that when that happens in the couple, I mean, it's something that might bring you together, but often it creates a wall. And the solutions and the icebreakers you found through your studies are very much oriented in the society, in the life world, which is great because it's a way to reposition yourself in life. Have you come across anything that works within the family system, so with different people that are grieving for the same loss, or
yeah,
do you think that the way is to start from the world and then probably bring from the world inside?
I think Yeah, I think well, I wouldn't want to imply a sort of a one size fits all approach. We found a variety of experience in the men we spoke to, both in the way it had affected their relationships with their partner, and in whether their partner was involved in the same process of getting support. For some men, going to therapy as a couple, going to a support group as a couple, seemed to
Mm.
work. A lot of the men found that those were often quite female or mother oriented. Quite understandably, the mothers seemed to be the priority where the health service or the hospital was providing care, and the men often felt sort of left out or on the fringes. The football teams that we studied actually do try to involve the partners as well. So the women are encouraged to come along to the social activities. But we found a variety of experiences. So, some men, yes, needed to go outside the family unit, and there was something about being with other men that seemed to work for them. But that's not true for all men, is it? And yes, there were some very very sad experiences of couple relationships that have broken down, particularly over the question of whether to try for another child. I was speaking to a man recently. I did another interview. Well, two men I spoke to had very different experiences. One couple, they were both very keen to try for another child immediately, and they actually have had other children. Whereas the other man said, my wife is still so traumatized that I can't even raise the topic with her. It will take time, but she's so afraid of the same thing happening again. So I don't know if that answers your question, Susie. I just there's a huge variety of experience as you're aware, I'm sure. Yeah.
Thank you. No, that's really nice way to address the problem. Nicole.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. That was super interesting. I should say that as a feminist, sometimes I got a bias, of course, towards towards, how is possible that woman, I don't know if it's statistics or what, but generally speaking, in one experience, woman, when they are facing with incredibly hard issues like grief and perinatal loss, they tend to seek for help more often than men. I
Yeah.
don't know if something that it's assumed in my culture, which
Hmm.
is I think even worse than British culture from this perspective, because there is this gender stereotype that men are strong, men do not cry, and this of course is very problematic for them specifically. And I really appreciate, I wasn't aware of that men try to enters in systems where they can do something
Hmm.
physically, like playing football. It's like a universal language in some cultures for men. So I was wondering, first of all, how this kind of associations work. Like there are men who are professionals and they, let's say, spread call to action to men online, or it's something that came from men who are not in the healthcare system, let's say, and then just go
Mm.
together and try to find ways to make sense of their
Yeah.
experience. So I
Yeah.
have this curiosity actually.
Yeah, well, certainly the initiatives that we studied had no professional therapeutic or health involvement. So these were men who'd experienced bereavement themselves who set up the teams. Um, and as I say, they, as one man said to me, if I'd he went on the local radio to launch his team, and he had about 30 men immediately signed up. And he said, if I'd said on that local radio station, let's all meet in the pub and talk about our bereavement, he said nobody would have come. But
Certo.
because it was a football team, they came, and eventually they did talk. Um, so I don't know whether it was important that there was no professional support in terms of therapeutic support, but it didn't seem to matter. There was mutual support. It's interesting, yeah. I think it's not just And one could easily get into, the trouble is one easily gets into stereotyping men's and women's behavior, but one can only talk about the men one knows. But it, as well as it being something physical, I think it was just the primary thing is doing something active. So a lot of these men talked about, my immediate response was I wanted to go and fundraise for a charity that helped bereaved parents. I wanted to do something about it, and that I knew that would help me. And then they found these sort of physical, embodied forms of activity, which really seemed to answer their need. So football seemed incidental, but as you say, it was a kind of universal language. A lot of the men we spoke to weren't great footballers and they weren't great football fans, but it was just the fact that it was for bereaved men, and there was no pressure on you to be a great footballer or to be brilliant, to love football. But it was an avenue, and it might have been running, it might have been walking, it might have been something artistic, but it was outside. It was externalizing the problem, the issue, in an active way, rather than sitting in a room and talking. Although that seemed to be a later product.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, and sorry. No, I was just going to add that, Nicole, that my other research with young men particularly has found that those persistent sort of stereotypes about men not crying, men not seeking help, despite all the changes that have taken place in gender identities and gender relationships. And I think it varies a lot. We talk to young men from different social classes, different ethnic groups, and there's a lot of geographical and cultural variety. But generally, for a lot of young men, those stereotypical expectations around not openly expressing your feelings and not seeking professional help still apply. Sorry, another question.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. It was very nice. I wanted to ask about, I found the aspect of embodiment very interesting in I think this grief process. And it made me think also of using embodied physical activities for other therapeutic reasons. And I think in the West, especially, the way we understand trauma or grief and the solution, so to speak, to these things are either very talk therapy oriented, or there are very intentional spaces created as a different mode. So I wanted to ask if you also researched other parts of the world and how grief and trauma and masculinity is processed there in other countries. Because masculinity, of course, conceptualized differently around the world, but I think also grief and trauma and spaces where we grieve together or come together or support each other intersubjectively, it also varies a lot around the world. So I was wondering if you also researched that.
Yeah. No, I have to say most of the initiatives I'm aware of around this sort of bodily or intercorporeal therapy or whatever have been Western, have been sort of North American or European. It's a fascinating question because I think you're right that masculinities are diverse geographically and culturally, and responses to trauma and responses to grief vary. So I would be very interested. I mean, until recently, there's been very little research on men and fathers and grief. So I would love to hear about any research that's happened in non-Western cultures, perhaps drawing on different cultural and spiritual traditions. Yeah, I mean, maybe other people, I don't know, Susie, whether you know from your research on, you have got some really good examples of intercorporeal therapy in your writing, but I don't know whether any of those come from other parts of the world besides sort of Western cultures, but it'll be fascinating to explore.
Yeah, I also find it really interesting in the West, these like traumatic or hard events, we really take them as like solid ruptures that need to be understood in a narrative that is like from bad to good, and we try to fix it. And I think we intentionally create these spaces because they lack in the culture. But there, I think a lot of cultures, I'm from Turkey, for example, there it's more like Italy, I think. So it would be, for example, impossible to think about like men coming together to create a very open space, for example. And their grief practices are also different for families and for grieving other things. But I think it would be very interesting to see also cultures where they maybe create these spaces unintentionally, and it's just a part of the cultural practices to maybe draw inspiration and compare. But I think it would also be fascinating to research. So
that's the next stage of our research, perhaps. That'd be interesting to find some international partners to talk about those things. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, just a reminder, if people on YouTube wants to ask question, write it down and we'll discuss them aloud. And to piggyback on what Daphne and Martin were saying, yeah, the most I know comes from, I'm terrible with the camera, from this book, which is a great book. It's a little dated now, though, Kasulis, Intimacy or Integrity. And yeah, it's interesting to see how Western and Eastern society, if you want, perceive the notion of intimacy and integrity. I mean, the way clearly the Western society is much more individualized, and we have the sense of our nucleus that is very small. While for non-Western societies, the one is many, but it's still one. It's way less individualized. So it could be really interesting to see also the practices from an anthropological point of view, how they have to digest a loss. I mean, if you already see from as you were saying a little bit, Daphne, from the northern to the south of Italy, how things change, because the southerners are a more collective society, and so there are precise steps of grievances that grief that you have to follow, and these are already steps that are embedded in the society to digest. And in the north of the Italy, it's a little more individualistic, and so on. And I had a question for you, Martin, another question, which might be a little tough. I don't know. I was in another seminar before, and we were discussing about how hard it is to define care, especially nowadays. I mean, and you are such a specialist. I mean, you had this Comstock show, but it's a podcast on care, and you did this in-depth study on loss and masculinity and fatherhood. How do you think care translates in these relationships? How would you define care as they found it in these groups? What would be the defining term?
Well, that's why I raised that question about, well, first of all, I wondered whether to call it care. So I presented this at the recent conference of the Care Ethics Research Consortium, and it did make me think, would care specialists call what happens in these initiatives care? And I think it is. I mean, there's a process going on by which people's emotional and psychological needs are being met, in which they are being supported in processing. There's a need to support those processes and for healing and for repair of some kind. So care is happening, but I think it's less obvious who's doing the care, which is why I think it's interesting. And I want to look at this further in terms of these mutual support initiatives, because care is there. People are getting cared for. They're getting something from it, but it's not it's kind of a flow between people, and there's no distinct carer on the one side or caregiver and care receiver on the other hand. And I think that's really interesting, because it throws up in the air all these categories that we use, when we try to describe what's happening in care. So people talk about support. They talk about, as I say, about healing, about process. But I think these men felt cared for by the experience, by the group, by the atmosphere, and by other men. They perhaps wouldn't use that word. I mean, again, that's about masculinity, isn't it? Perhaps, they wouldn't say, I love these men, or I care for these men, but it's what's happening. Yeah. So I think it raises very interesting questions about how we define care, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's deeply intercorporeal and embedded, I mean, embodied. So much so that you don't understand who is caring and who is the cared for.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. It's something that happens also, I mean, sorry to interrupt, in friendship. When the relationship of care is not univocal, but you bring stuff in a very natural flow, in a natural way, and not in a setting like the one of therapy, when in some sort you may feel like you have to give something to the caregiver, and you have some expectation about being healed by. And I think that this is a very interesting case, the ones you mentioned, Rob, that show how friendship and these kind of collective gatherings may help us to rethink care in a more energetic way, I'd say.
Yeah,
And not
I've been using the word distributed, but when you look up distributed care, it means something different. It's a technical word that health providers use, but it's coming close. It's dynamic, it's mutual, it's a flow back and forth, and you can't sort of say who starts it or who initiates it. But as you say, it's like friendship. It's just there in the air between people, and I do think I think touch and the sensory have an important part to play in that. That it's communicated through in these initiatives. It's communicated somehow through the body. Not that these men are touching each other like this. Some of the examples that Susie quotes in her book of, people actually almost sort of physically transferring energy to another person through touch. These men are not doing that, but they are moving together somehow in a flow that somehow the embodiedness of it creates care. Yeah.
Bello. Generative.
fascinating.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, I think it is.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, it's like, it's not disembodied, like, I don't know, empathy. Sometimes talking about empathy in this case is leave me with a sense of, not being really satisfied, because it seems all a theoretical exercise when you have to put yourself in a certain position and then make an effort. In this case, which is interesting, is that care, let's say, emerges from the intercorporeal encounters.
Yes.
It's not something that you're forced to do.
It's emergent. That's a good word. Another good word to add. Distributed and emergent. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think as scholars, we have the responsibility to do the zigzag, to study, but coming back to life and bring it to life. Otherwise, we fall in the risk of abstractions and creating a language that is hard for life to get in. Yeah, and maybe we did that with empathy. I created a big book on empathy. It was lots of words in it.
That's super interesting. Of course, I mean, phenomenology actually grows on empathy. Well, that is. But now it's when cookie cutter, like, every time it's like, oh, empathy. And this is a risk.
Yeah. Obviously, I'd recommend Susie's work on it, but I would also recommend Christine Leroy, who I interviewed, the dance philosopher. Her book is coming out in English this summer on kinesthetic empathy, and it's just really interesting the way she talks about in watching dance or in experiencing art, that involuntary empathy of the body. And she says that we've lost that embodied sense in empathy, and she traces the notion of empathy right back to Edith Stein, and says originally philosophers, phenomenologists particularly, thought of empathy, Einfühlung, as a bodily feeling together, and we've turned it into something cognitive. So maybe we need to recover that and recover the sense that it's something that happens in an involuntary way through the body as well as through intentionality.
Yeah, it's a sign of our time. Yeah, let's see. I mean, empathy also was used by Thomas Lipsy in aesthetic settings. So it's something really visceral in some sort. But Susie, I'm not the expert of empathy, so I just stop here.
Susie is.
No one is can be expert on empathy, thank God. Yeah, it's this bodily feeling. I totally agree. The aesthetic of empathy. Beautiful. Anyway, I don't see. Oh, I stopped checking on YouTube. Sorry. Yeah, I don't see any question here, nor on the chat. So we can thank Martin for the amazing presentation. And it was extremely, it was an extreme pleasure for me to have you opening this series of webinars. So we shared also the adventure of the interview for Il Foglio, for No Care. So it's nice to be together here. And so see you for our next webinar next Friday. I wish I remember what we're going to talk about, but I don't. It would have been a nice transition. But still, do you remember, Nicole? Wonderful. No, okay.
But I'm pregnant, so you know.
Still perinatal care. So thank you everyone for being here today, especially you, Martin.
Thank you for the privilege of taking part. Nice to see you all. Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Good evening.
Bye.